All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Priscilla Calleros, and I use ella, she, her pronouns. I'm the Event and Outreach Manager for the Environmental Center. I just want to mention that we are recording this event. So thank you, Leah and attendees for being here. Udara?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. Good afternoon. My name is Adara Abesekara-Bickett. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the program manager for the Environmental Center's Rethink Waste program. I'm excited to be co-facilitating this conversation with Priscilla this afternoon.
Yeah, very excited to have you. So our mission here at the Environmental Center is to embed sustainability into daily life in Central Oregon. This evening, I'd like to start by paying respect and expressing gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we exist on. I encourage everyone to center yourselves and take a moment while I read our land acknowledgement. And I can go ahead and share my screen. The Environmental Center is on the traditional land of the Northern Paiute, the Wasco, and the Warm Springs tribes, known as the Confederated Tribes of the Warm Springs Indian Reservation of Oregon. These tribes also had interactions with other surrounding tribes, including, but not limited to, the Klamath, Modoc, Yahuskin, Saniam, and the Malala. We recognize and respect Indigenous people as the original stewards of this land where we live, work, recreate, and learn. Our facility, our garden, and program exists on stolen land. We are simply guests with our tribal neighbors, making homes and legacies in these spaces together. Many values, ideas, and resources the Environmental Center shares are rooted in the Indigenous ways of life. When we call on our community to protect the planet and her people, we acknowledge that this interconnectedness has been delicately sustained by Indigenous people since the beginning of time. Throughout history and today, our Indigenous neighbors are most impacted by social and environmental injustices, reminding us that there is still work to be done. We will continue to learn from and build relationships with tribal communities who have a profound understanding of climate change and how to care for forests, deserts, waterways, wildlife, and people. We commit to uplifting, celebrating, and including Indigenous voices as we deliver programs, events, and advocate for a sustainable future. Land acknowledgement is a new practice for the Environmental Center and a way for us to express gratitude to those who came before us and the land that sustains us, to start dialogue and to encourage ongoing education and action. The Environmental Center's land acknowledgement was developed in partnership with local Indigenous community leaders and elders who were compensated for their time and expertise. We are grateful to them, to each of them, for sharing their history and stories. And I will now talk about green drinks. So apologies. So every other month, the Environmental Center reaches out to community groups to co-host Green Drinks. Green Drinks is an international concept and is a way to bring people and businesses, groups, individuals together to discuss advancing a sustainable future for everyone in Central Oregon. We encourage everyone to support our programming by becoming a member. And you can become a member by going to our website, envirocenter.org/support us and donating. Tonight we'll be giving away Leah's book, and to anyone that donates, we want to thank Jack Schneip from Cascade Financial Strategies for sponsoring this event. We were able to purchase some books, and we'd love to get this book out into the community. So we encourage you to reach out to us if you would like a copy. And again, we'll be sharing this recording with everyone. And we encourage those that are watching right now to submit any questions for Leah. Thank you again.
Thanks, Priscilla. I think we can end the screen share whenever you're ready. So I have the pleasure of introducing our host today. Leah Thomas is a celebrated environmentalist based in Santa Barbara, California, coining the term eco-communicator to describe her style of environmental activism. Leah uses her passion for writing and creativity to explore and advocate for the critical yet often overlooked relationship between social justice and environmentalism. With this intersection in mind, Leah founded and launched Intersectional Environmentalist in 2020, a resource hub and platform that aims to advocate for environmental justice, provide educational resources surrounding intersectional environmentalism, and promote inclusivity and accessibility within environmental education and movements. Leah, who is also the founder of eco lifestyle blog at Green Girl Leah, uses her multiple years of eco-focused education and work experience to inform her ever-expanding list of projects, as well as her audience of more than 400,000 followers across channels, which is super impressive. A graduate of Chapman University with a BS in Environmental Science and Policy and a cluster in Comparative World Religions, Leah has interned twice with the National Park Service and has worked at leading green companies, including eco-friendly soap company Ecos, and most recently Patagonia. A fundamental optimist and opportunity maker, Leah used her time after being furloughed during the pandemic to create Intersectional Environmentalist. Leah's book, The Intersectional Environmentalist, How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and the Planet, published March 8th, 2022. Her writing has also appeared in a variety of publications, including Vogue, Elle, Marie Claire, and High Snobiety. And she has been featured in Harper's Bazaar, W Magazine, ABC News Live, Domino, Goop, and numerous podcasts. Wow. Leah, we're so thrilled for you to be joining us today. Just want to start off by asking if there's anything you'd like to add for folks to get to know you a little bit better. I know you shared at the start of this book what brought you to this work. Could you give our guest today a glimpse into your sustainability story by way of an introduction?
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. This is such a cool program and initiative, so I'm honored to be here. I guess a little bit more about my story. I grew up in the Midwest, right outside of St. Louis, Missouri, but I've been in Southern California since about 2014, and that's when I started studying environmental science and policy. And as I began my studies in environmental science, that's kind of when the Black Lives Matter movement in some ways started, very close to home. I grew up in a town that was about 10 minutes away from Ferguson, Missouri. So the uprisings of Ferguson occurred side by side with my environmental education. And I think experiencing that and really just thinking of, social justice reform and criminal justice reform while also studying environmental science made me really narrow in on the intersections of those two things and really focus on environmental justice. So that's a little bit about my background and what brought me to this work. And then I think working in nonprofit spaces or in academic spaces or even corporate sustainability, just really seeing environmental justice being siloed in ways that I thought that it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be separate from traditional environmental education or the missions of large environmental organizations, because if you're not advocating for people and the planet at the same time, I don't think that environmentalism really stands for justice at all. And I'm sure we'll unpack that a little bit more and get into it. But yeah, that's what brought me to this work that I do today.
That's awesome. Thank you for that introduction and giving us a glimpse into how it all got started. So first I want to talk about, I'm just going to dive into the book. Here, you talked about these silos and environmental justice and social justice. And you talk about here in your book, I've stood alongside my white environmentalist peers at climate protests and work alongside them in my environmental studies. And while working in corporate sustainability and beyond, I felt abandoned by the environmental community during acts of unjustifiable violence against people of color. And you say, you continue, I lent myself to the cause. And something that really struck me, you said, I adhered to the status quo of environmentalism because I felt like I was doing my duty for the planet and hoped that I proved myself to be a loyal follower. Then maybe advocacy for my people would be brought to the table. And that really struck me, being somewhat new to Central Oregon, working for an environmental organization that also believes in, so I personally, believe in social justice. I grew up in South Los Angeles. I witnessed the riots, of Rodney King. And now in this environmental movement, I've seen some injustice happen here in Central Oregon. Not too long ago, a young man was murdered in downtown. And I want to ask, like, how did you cultivate that sense of community? And when you talk about being passionate about social justice and, kind of being let down by the, environmental community that you lent yourself to, and it not being reciprocated or people not speaking up when injustices happen, how did you have to walk away from groups or relationships, or how did you cultivate that sense of community?
Yeah, it's really difficult and honestly heartbreaking. And I don't think that I understood that it was heartbreak until a little bit later. But it's heartbreaking to think that you could be working alongside people for a really long time and you think you're in it together to save the planet. And whether it's intentional or not, that silence, it hurts because, my emotional labor and so many people of color, our emotional labor is going into protecting the planet. And then when our communities are being impacted by both environmental injustices, which should fall within the scope of environmentalism, or racial injustice, and then to kind of see silence or, not issuing statements. I think that really during the summer of 2020, especially when there were so many acts of unjustifiable violence towards people of color, and so many environmental organizations just didn't know what to do and were silent, I think that's when I really had it. And I just understood that I can no longer take part in a type of environmentalism that does not also advocate for people of color and the world's most marginalized populations, because that makes no sense at all to me in any way, shape, or form. So I had to make a difficult decision to leave a job that I really, really liked. It was easy because I was furloughed, but I left the job and just thought, what, the community is out there. There's so many people like me that are working in similar environmental organizations who feel the exact same way that I do. So we just need a coalition build ourselves. And then I started finding the POC affinity groups at these other big greens and other organizations. And then it made me feel like I wasn't so alone and that I've never been alone. But it's a really difficult realization. And this happens throughout history and a lot of movements to people of color, kind of positioning it as, okay, well, if we accomplish our goal, then maybe we can focus on the liberation of your people. But it doesn't happen like that, because when you're looking at the Earth Day movement, like I talk about in my book, during the 60s and 70s, there were 20 million people who participated in the first Earth Day. But then 10 years later, in the 80s, there had to be an environmental justice movement because people of color were like, wait, whoa. So we have the Environmental Protection Agency, but instead you're just dumping the toxic waste in our neighborhoods. What about saving the earth? What about doing this together? And that movement definitely didn't have the support of those 20 million people. So I think I'm at a point where I'm no longer going to ask, okay, well, I'll lend myself to the cause and our liberation will come later, because it oftentimes doesn't come later. So.
Thanks, Leah. Just really appreciate you being vulnerable in both your book and just here with us as well, to share that experience. And I think a lot of people of color in the environmental movement go through some form of that and just really resonate with that experience. I want to dive into some of the context, or set some context for folks here. And correct me if I'm mispronouncing Deandra Marisette's name, co-founder of Intersectional Environmentalist. And Deandra is quoted in the book describing that intersectional environmentalism is the lens and that environmental justice is the goal. Can you expand on these concepts to bring us all up to speed here, especially for folks who may not have read the book yet or are not familiar with these movements?
Absolutely. I think when I started talking about intersectional environmentalism, which I feel like has existed for a long time, whether or not people call it that, there's different words for different things about protecting people on the planet. Very quickly, there are people who started to say, well, we already have environmental justice, so why do we need this complicated term? Like, what's going on here? But I realized, like I said, we have had environmental justice as a field of study for a really long time, but it's often siloed and it shouldn't be. So I think there needs to be an intersectional approach to environmentalism that leads to environmental justice. So for everyone, for both people and the planet to be liberated. And it's kind of similar to intersectional feminism versus, feminism that's not intersectional. Non-intersectional feminism might not focus or prioritize the concerns of women of color or trans women or people with overlapping identities. And I was finding a similar thing in the mainstream environmental movement where people weren't talking about eco-ableism or making sure queer people feel safe outside or really focusing about how someone's identity is usually the number one indicator of whether or not they'll experience environmental injustice. So I think there needs to be an intersectional approach to environmentalism so we can accomplish the goal of environmental justice and environmental liberation, where both people and the planet are not exploited at the same time. But I want to really clarify, because so many environmental justice elders have been doing the work for a very long time. And intersectional environmentalism, in part, is to also make their work and contributions to environmental history necessary within environmental education so people can really understand the impact that they've had. Because that's another concern that I have when I was learning about environmental science at a predominantly white university. And most universities, I'm doing an audit right now, it's not mandatory to learn about the mother and father of environmental justice. It's not mandatory to learn about the first, the only Chicano organizer of Earth Day and everything that he started. So I want our stories to also be included within environmental education, which is also a part of intersectional environmentalism.
Thank you for that, Leah. Wow, I feel like I could just talk to you all day. So when we created the Zoom registration link, we asked folks to submit some questions as when they registered. So this is going to be a question from one of the Zoom registration. They asked, how can we as activists work together better to intersectionalize the various causes that we focus on?
That's a great question. I think one of the things is also talking about lateral oppression, which I talk about in the book, which is also really important for communities of color as we coalition build, because we're stronger together. Because sometimes you'll run into things that are very comparative or comparing the struggles of different groups of people. And I think there's ways that we can hold space for all of those struggles and really just hear people and meet them where they're at. Because I think with me navigating this space as a Black woman, and now the majority of people that I interact with are people of color in the environmental movement that have their own organizations, their own affinity spaces, etc. And finding ways for me to know that it doesn't take away for the advocacy of my people to also advocate for other groups within this movement. So that's something that people can reckon with, even if you're already coming from kind of a historically under-amplified group of people, making sure that you're also open to coalition building with Indigenous-led organizations, queer-led organizations, Latinx-led organizations, whatever it might be, because we really are just so much stronger together. And I've seen that. And then outside of that, I think remembering that a lot of people are the bearers of their own solutions, these historically under-amplified voices, and they know exactly what they need to do to solve the issues in their neighborhoods. Oftentimes they know the issues in their neighborhoods and the disparities that exist. Not everyone, but usually there's like a group that's organizing to create change, but they need resources, support, and amplification. So understanding that you don't have to create a solution for them, but you can help fund their work, help amplify their work. If you're working at a huge environmental organization, help convince them to practice some wealth redistribution so they can, solve things in their community themselves and feel empowered. So those are a couple things to do. And then lastly, just really taking the time to learn. I feel like that's the fun part. It's not learning out of punishment, but thinking about what was left out of my environmental education. I learned about people like John Muir, who are some of these other people that also contributed in their own unique way. And then once you learn about their histories and their stories and their contributions, I feel like you'll always have that in the back of your head, and it'll kind of inform the way that you approach environmentalism.
Thanks, Leah. I think what you shared, what you just said, like people are the bearers of their own solutions is really important. And I just wanted to uplift that. So kind of, building on that and also going back to what you shared a few minutes ago, I wanted to give you the opportunity to share any stories of environmental justice heroes like Hazel M. Johnson or Dr. Robert Bullard, or anyone else, that really inspired you or influenced you in your work.
I just read an article that everyone should check out if you can. It's called All My Environmental Heroes Are Black Women. And I just published it in Vogue. So some of the people that were featured in that is the lovely Betty Reed Soskin. I just met her a couple weeks ago. She just retired. She joined the Park Service at 85 as a Black woman, just reinventing herself and going into a new career. And she just retired at the age of 100. So it was so cool to have that conversation with her and just see how she just showed up as her full self and really transformed the park that she was working at. So Betty is one of my heroes. Teresa Baker is also a hero of mine. She created the Outdoor CEO Diversity Pledge that really kind of shook up the outdoor industry, which was very cool. And she, alongside Patty Gonia and Jose Gonzalez of Latino Outdoors, just founded a new nonprofit called the Outdoorsist Oath. So everyone should check that out. And then there's just really so many people, but I think a lot of the heroes to me are people that have empowered people empower people. So, other people of color in this space that have been mentors to me, and there's just so many, like Dr. Ray Wynn Grant, who's a really cool black bear ecologist. And a lot of them are in the book, so check it out. Probably everyone on the IE Council is also a really big hero of mine.
Yes, we are well aware of everyone, and Patty herself lives here in Bend and was just at our Earth Day celebration last weekend. So shout out to Patty for the work that they're doing here, and it's awesome to have them a part of our community as well. So we're getting some awesome questions in the chat. So I want to acknowledge that again, attendees, if you want to submit your questions, we have a Q&A. So I'll start with one that was submitted. I'm interested in learning more about abolition teaching tools in the garden to empower kiddos.
This is a really good question. I feel like something I definitely need to read up a little bit more on. I've been trying to understand abolition a little bit more and approaches, like abolitionist approaches to different things. So I might have to circle back once I have a really good understanding. But if you all have any thoughts. Yeah, I'm not too sure, but that was great. If you have another question, please ask and I'll try to answer it.
Yeah, we Udara, do you want to take this one?
Sure. Thanks, Leah. I also just want to acknowledge, just appreciating that we all have a lot to learn, and I appreciate you naming that, and not making something up for us. So another question we have in the chat is, first they have a comment, such a great book, thank you. What are your thoughts around how to navigate offering Indigenous knowledge to help heal our world, whilst also trying to protect that intellectual property, and they write that in quotes, and not have it co-opted or appropriated and used within broken systems, i.e. destructive capitalist context, since our tools / wisdom are inherently at odds with those destructive systems?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I feel like my answer will be imperfect because, like you acknowledge, we're living in imperfect systems. So it's kind of hard when we're trying to navigate these broken educational systems. But one thing I think, giving credit where credit is due, for some reason, when it comes to people of color, racism, crediting us is controversial in some ways, or like, why do I have to reference this person? But in science, when it comes to white folks, that's almost standard. When someone names an endangered species or when they create a theory, it's written down. So I think it is really important, even when you're talking about regenerative agriculture, also talking about Indigenous peoples worldwide that are also practicing regenerative techniques and kind of calling it what it is and just giving credit where credit is due as much as possible and seeing that as a positive thing and really just kind of telling the full story. So I think credit is really, really important. Another thing that I struggle with, and I put this in the book about intersectional theory, because I want people to remember that intersectional theory came from a Black woman named Dr. Kimberlé Crenshaw. And I've been hearing people use the word intersectionality kind of out of context or using it as a replacement word for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And sometimes I struggle with that because I know what intersectional theory means to me as a Black woman and why I've applied it to environmentalism, but not everybody will understand that. But at times that's just what happens, and I can't completely stop people from co-opting terminology. But again, I think giving credit where it's due as much as possible is important. So if you're learning about a new theory and framework, just kind of figuring out who the pioneers of that are. But it's something that I do struggle with because sometimes buzzwords get picked up, and I think intersectionality is getting picked up in a way that it wasn't necessarily intended to be picked up in. But again, I'm not really sure the perfect solution for that. But I think if you in your spaces can advocate for giving credit where it's due, that's kind of a step in the right direction. But understanding that co-opters will continue to co-opt probably, and we can, nicely call them in when we can.
Yes, calling them in. And I know earlier you talked about creating spaces for POCs and affinity groups. And one thing I wanted to ask, in spaces or organizations where intersectional environmentalism is a newer concept in the environmental movement, do you have any advice for women of color specifically navigating this work and this space that can sometimes feel like super isolating and sometimes challenging? And I know you talked about, creating affinity spaces, but specifically here in Central Oregon, there is, more diversity, more POC stepping into, leadership roles and folks stepping aside, and that's awesome to see. But still, it's still very white led. And so, yeah, I was wondering if you can speak to some of that.
Yeah, I think part of it, and kind of going back to community building, at times I felt so alone in the environmental space. And then I had a conversation with Dr. Robert Bullard, the founder of Environmental Justice, and he's like, where you been? Are you at historically Black colleges and universities? Because we've been around doing this work together, coalition building. So I was like, maybe I'm in the wrong spaces. And that's okay because, where I was living, Orange County, but honestly, I could have stepped outside of Orange County and went on over to Santa Ana and I would have found community. So sometimes it's just understanding that, okay, if I'm working at a big green, it might be slow. It might be slow to get to a place where I would truly feel comfortable in this space. So I'm going to take a little bit of emotional labor and put it into the improvement of this organization. But what's more important is figuring out how I can create that community now, because it is essential and it's something that you need. So whether it's online, like digital community, that can be nice too. I follow all these different organizations, Outdoor Afro, Brave Trails, Hike Club, etc., and just filling my social media feed with joyful people of color outdoors is a constant reminder of I am not alone. Even if I am in the whitest of white organizations, I'm not alone. So I think reminding ourselves of that and trying our hardest to find that community, whether it's just seeing it visually or going out for a hike with Outdoor Afro or whatever the group might be, I think that's so nourishing and so important, because I can't say with certainty that many of these environmental organizations are going to change overnight. I think it's going to be slow change. I think many of them have updated their mission statements after 2020, but seeing how they're fully embracing that and reworking their organizations, it's going to take some time. So sometimes, and I know this probably isn't the best answer, but just knowing exactly what it is. Like when I went to school in Orange County, California, I didn't know what it was for a really long time. I just kept thinking, like, why are people like this? Why are people like this? Why are people like this? And I understand why. I was going to school in a very particular area and I could do my best, but I wasn't going to lose myself and my wellness to completely try to reconstruct a system that was never designed for me in the first place. And just understanding how much of my emotional labor that I wanted to put into that, so other people who are coming into the space after me would have a safer space, but also understanding that it's not necessarily my sole responsibility to do that. And in the meantime, finding that space and community when you can.
Thanks, Leah. Yeah, I really resonate with that experience in Orange County, and just reflecting on when you're the intersectional environmentalists and like environmentalists for Black Lives went viral. I was managing a sustainability resource center at UC Irvine, and a lot of students are the ones that brought your work to my attention, and it was just really powerful. And I understand that social media played a big role in intersectional environmentalists and kind of gaining momentum with younger audiences or more tech engaged audiences. And you're speaking to buzzwords and concepts getting picked up sometimes. And I wonder if you could share some of the wins and challenges that you've experienced from movements operating in the social media landscape.
I would say some of the wins is utilizing social media in ways that make it really easy for educators to use those materials and add them to their curriculum. Because I've seen that happen really quickly. And that's not something that we thought would happen initially when we were making social media graphics, condensing research and encouraging people to read about these different topics that weren't being taught in a lot of educational programs. And then having middle school and high school teachers and college professors saying, oh, we're using your student-led film that you made. And now, right now, I know it doesn't seem like a lot. We had a cohort of students of color make a video called The Intersectional History of Environmentalism and the history that they wanted to be taught. And now it has 20,000 views a year later. And that's a win for us because we get comments from students who are like, I'm watching this in my classroom right now. So I think it's really great to see the ways that educational systems are changing. And I think, like you said, it's because of students. There are students who are sharing these posts on social media with their professors, and professors are using it because they want it to be relatable to the students that they're teaching. So I guess one win was at the school I went to, Chapman University in Orange County. A couple months after Intersectional Environmentalist started, a student who later became an intern of ours said that she wanted an environmental justice class within the curriculum. There was none, which is startling. But there's no class taught by a woman of color. she rallied enough students to tell the department, this is necessary. Also, like, we have to talk about this. This is the thing that we should do. And they won. So not too long after, they have the first environmental justice class that's being taught by a woman who's Indigenous to the area that the school is in. And I think that's such a cool win. And then they're now fighting to make that class mandatory. So to graduate with an environmental science degree, you need to take the class. So that gives me a lot of hope. And I think some challenges with using social media is a sense of legitimacy at times, even though we're using a lot of cited information. Sometimes our experiences as people of color or historically under amplified groups, it doesn't always come with a citation because it's just our experience and what we're observing. So sometimes people will downplay what we're doing and say, oh, you're just using cute graphics and colors and, you know, people should just go read a paper. But in so many ways, I feel like that's elitist. Because sometimes if somebody just happens to be on a train, on a bus, going to work, they're working a 60-hour work week, but they want to take their time to read a carousel post about environmental injustice and learn something that day, I think that that should be rewarded and everyone should have access to education. So there's a bit of a battle at times with academic elitism. And I think that's deeply stemming from people thinking only certain people deserve access to education, which is pretty messed up. So we stumble across that a lot.
Thank you, Leah. We are zooming through these questions and we just got another one. What would you most like for white people in the environmental movement, I'm guessing movement, to understand more clearly or to do differently to help make the environmental world more inclusive and embracing of intersectional thinking?
I think allies at times, just like understanding how powerful your voice might be, because there could be a person of color within your organization that's been raising issues of environmental justice or the importance of equity and inclusion, but they're not necessarily feeling heard or they kind of want to give up. But if as an ally, say for example, I worked in the outdoor industry, and also, sorry, my light is creating some sort of halo around me in this hotel room. Yeah, so when I was working in the outdoor industry, I remember talking about we need representation of people of color and these advertisements about climbing, about surfing. And I don't know how many times someone would say, oh, we can't find them. We can't find them. It's hard. We want to make sure that we're on brand for us. So kind of like microaggressions and things like that that occur. But I remember when a creative director who was white, who was helping to build the website, said, I don't want to do this rebrand if it's not inclusive and if we're not including people of color. And they listened with that extra authority that came. So I think being an ally when people are speaking up and using your voice in that way, it's way more important than you might think. Because oftentimes if people see someone they can relate to and they're like, oh, they're thinking this, then maybe I should be considering this or thinking this as well, even though they should be listening to other people. But it doesn't always work like that because there's a lot of defensiveness that comes up in those situations. In addition to that, just learning as much as you can. I think that cultural competency is way more important than people might think. So just learning about communities that are outside of your own, learning about their take on environmentalism and what it can look like for them, understanding what informs your view of environmentalism, because oftentimes people don't think that if you're the majority, like, oh, I mostly read textbooks by other white folks, or I learned about outdoor exploration and John Muir and these things. So this is why I think the way that I do. Or kind of just assessing your identity, because white people also have culture. So thinking about, okay, was it spirituality? That made me really care for the earth. Are there culture traditions that were passed down in my life that inform the way that I think? Because then I think it helps you become a little bit more compassionate and empathetic to other people's different cultural understandings about what the protection of the earth might look like or what their relationship to the earth might look like. So taking the time to be self-aware, and then also just learning about different experiences, like reading books like Braiding Sweetgrass, my book, and then supporting diverse environmental organizations.
Thanks, Leah. just on that topic of kind of advice for folks, I wonder if we could touch on a really locally specific example. As most of our attendees probably already know, our local not landfill is projected to be full by 2029. And the decision has been made to site a new landfill and solid waste management facility here in Deschutes County, after eliminating alternatives like trucking waste out to long distances to other counties. The county noted that one of the public outreach goals is to engage underrepresented communities to ensure that the committee is not looking just at sites where underrepresented communities might be. And they added that it's important from an environmental justice perspective. So one, I was reading your book around the time of this meeting, and really reflecting on the power of the work that Dr. Bullard highlighted, and just very specifically in this space around citing landfills and other toxic sites, and two, that it's like a great start for the county to be considering these elements. And so to you, what recommendations do you have for our community to stay engaged and put a intersectional environmentalist lens on this kind of decision-making in our community?
I think what you said was right on the mark, just making sure that diverse voices have a seat at the table in those decision-making processes. So definitely partnering with environmental justice organizations. Also, if it's in a specific city, also talking about economic revitalization and who's benefiting from that and jobs and things like that. Making sure that there's proper environmental quality assessments and things like that, just to really understand the impacts on people's health, because that's something that needs to be considered beforehand, before anything goes into construction, because it's usually considered afterwards. Really just assessing the surrounding community and how that might impact them, whether it's what they're breathing in, what they're smelling, etc. And again, yeah, just making sure they partner with local environmental justice orgs. Because in my book, I have a couple case studies about one that people might not even think of, because a landfill and toxic waste sites, people are like, that's horrible. But even when it comes to things like green energy and what the surrounding neighborhoods might experience if you put I don't consider nuclear green, but even if you put up a bunch of, like if you try to have a lithium, it's not a farm, but something like that, considering the indigenous communities that are surrounded, or if you're trying to have a wind farm, that's something that can actually really impact the surrounding communities. So even if it's something that's good, really checking in on how that project can impact the local communities, their water quality, their air quality, etc. And then making sure that diverse climate justice groups have a seat at the table in the decision making.
Agreed, most definitely. And in my role and just with events and outreach, I've really tried to make sure that our local Indigenous neighbors, our voices are at the table, and in any kind of partnerships and events that we've been working on establishing those relationships, and with our local tribes here in Central Oregon. So thank you for touching on that. One other question from our staff is around eco-grief and eco-anxiety. Do you experience any eco-grief / eco-anxiety in your work? And if so, how do you cope with those feelings, or and how are you having this conversation in the context of intersectional environmentalism?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think I had to understand that I was grieving in some ways. It's not always easy to understand that you're grieving, because sometimes you might feel irritable or stressed, and it could be because of anxiety and grief. But then understanding that for the last 2 years, most of us have been grieving something, because it's COVID, we're in a pandemic, student loans, climate crisis. Like there's so many things that are going on. So I think self-awareness of it is perfectly normal to feel anxious about a world that feels like it is on fire. So really validating those feelings, I think, is the first step before developing coping mechanisms and not just putting them aside. Like if you're feeling extra irritable, that's normal because we've had a really big shakeup in the way the world works right now. But another thing, I was reading an article, I forget who it was by, but it said something along the lines of like, the climate crisis is not the first existential threat that people of color have faced. So understanding that there have been a lot of communities of color who are also experiencing, I guess, climate anxiety and have for a long time. They've been suffering with drought internationally. There have been wars because of scarcity of resources and food, etc. So I think when we talk about eco-anxiety, it is important to have some context to privilege and how it might play a role, because there are communities around the world that are living with different types of climate anxiety and things like that, and have been for a really long time. And that isn't to invalidate our feelings and experiences, but I think it's also important to realize that, ooh, okay, especially if you're not a person of color and you're feeling eco-anxiety, also understanding that a lot of Black and brown folks are also experiencing these existential threats to their lives because of other things like structural and systemic racism, fearing for their lives every time that they leave their homes. So just understanding that that's something that's, you know, going on for a lot of different people, and putting some context there. But again, for coping skills, I think it really is coping skills that you would use for regular anxiety as well. But also rooting yourself in climate solutions and optimism. There's so many scare tactics in the environmental space. And I don't want to call them tactics because, I mean, it exists. Like there's really scary things that are happening right now. But I think there needs to be more focus on solutions that are available, who the people are that are creating these solutions, diverse people around the world, and the hope that maybe we can work towards. Because without that, I think it's just really destabilizing for a lot of people. So try to counteract that with looking into joy and climate optimism as well.
Thanks, Leah. I am also a strong believer in cultivating personal resilience in order to advocate for a resilient planet and future. So joy gets us there, I think. We have another question from the chat. So they're making an observation here. Climate issues affect all of us, and we need all hands on deck. What are your thoughts on, quote, chipping away at the edges of the, quote, lifted truck crowd to actually get them on board? How do we get the people who don't gravitate to climate issues to join us, at least in a practical sense?
I would say first is understanding why certain people might not gravitate towards climate issues and empathizing with them, because some people are just focused on survival. So it's not that they don't care, but especially when you're talking about lower income folks and populations, people, they're just working. And we're also talking about people that are largely not responsible for the climate crisis, and trying to activate them to care when they might be dealing with survival, things going on in their own communities, etc. And it might just feel like an added burden on top of their lives that are really hard. So I think that is really important to consider. Especially because at times communities of color get further demonized, almost thinking that we don't care about these issues, but we do, because naturally, even if you look at veganism and plant-based diets, Black and Latinx communities are becoming vegan at higher rates than their white counterparts by really high numbers. We are changing our eating habits. They might be rooted in different reasons, but it's also really good for the environment. So that's also important to understand some of those cultural things. But outside of that, I think meeting people where they're at is really important. I saw an interview with Dolly Parton the other day that I really liked, where she said that she thought that the earth was one of God's creations, and we need to treat the earth like we would want to treat our mothers, and we would want to, you know, something about God. And I'm not super religious, but I thought it was really cool that she was trying to activate another community. And it reminded me of a time where I spoke at a church in Orange County that tends to lean pretty conservative. but talking to people in their own language and meeting them where they're at, like, caring about the earth, caring about its people. If that's something that's really, something that's a part of your values because of your religious practices or whatever it can be, then let's do that. Or also kind of positioning it in a positive way. I think for me and my family, honestly, what got them is talking about cost savings. Even though I wish I would have got them to be environmentalists, just because I'm like, I love the earth, you should love it so much, but also showing them how much money they could save and how much it would benefit them to use reusables and, take shorter showers and things like that. And then now, all these years later, I started studying environmental science in like 2014. Now they just do things. So I never had to shame them into it. I was also leading by example and then showing them the benefits of living this way and not using those scare tactics, because the world on fire, kind of like in the movie Don't Look Up, which I thought was really brilliantly executed, for some reason, it just doesn't get people the way that it did. And I think it's just because Al Gore's documentary about all the scary things about climate change came out about 10, maybe 15 years ago. And I think there's so much fatigue about bad news right now, just about the current state of the world. I think showing people the positive wins, whether it's economic, showing them how it betters their lives. Like, oh, did you know having more trees in our neighborhood purifies our air? And that's also really good for wellness. That's really good for our community. I think that motivates people a little bit more. But yeah, that's a couple thoughts I have there.
Thank you for touching on that, Leah, because everything you said like just resonates with me, because I grew up in a very traditional Mexican household with a very strict mom on like, I appreciate that you talked about like, oh, Latinos don't care about the environment or PLC. And it's just like, we do, but it just doesn't look like the way you care about it, like, or mainstream environmentalism, right? Like, I grew up in a family of 5, and like we had to take short showers because we had to, right? Like to save on water, to save on the electricity, turning off the lights, reusing, the sour cream tub, thinking it was sour cream, but it was salsa, or like, like we're like the OG environmental stewardess, like, and I often struggle with that because a lot of folks, again, I'm going to say it, in the mainstream environmental movement, people think that it looks a certain way, and caring for the environment looks like this, or recycling looks like this, or and it doesn't. It doesn't look just one way. Your one way is your way, but it doesn't mean that just because I'm not doing it in your way doesn't mean I don't care about it. Like we do. We've been told from go outside, go and enjoy nature. And so thank you for talking about that, because there's this stigma that the POC community doesn't care about it. And you're right, sometimes the POC community is just surviving. But again, we have been taught, from our ancestors on how to care for the environment in our own way. So in our own cultural way, right? That aligns with who we are and our culture. So thank you for touching on that. We have a couple more minutes and I don't want to keep you any longer. I just want to just ask you for any, final thoughts that you want to leave us here with our audience here. Any closing thoughts?
I think if anything, just thinking intersectionally about environmentalism just can help you become a more compassionate and empathetic person. I think sometimes people position diversity, equity, and inclusion training as something that's like punishment, which is something that I think a lot of organizations can do differently. Like if bringing in a DEI consultant is something that is terrifying your staff, you're not doing it right, because it should be rooted in joy, the joy of representation, more than the trauma that comes without it. Talk about the trauma, but focus on the joy. So I think that's something that people can consider. Approach this joyfully. Think about all of the unsung heroes and how you can make them not unsung heroes. And think about all the amazing stories that you can share with people about diverse environmentalists and how your own perspective can shift just learning about more people. So I think that's kind of the biggest takeaway that I want to leave you all with, is just approach intersectional environmentalism with compassion and empathy and understanding, and know that we're always learning. We can never know enough. And when you get over that, I think it becomes easier to just learn a little bit more about other people and show them a little bit more love and the planet.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Leah. Udara, do you want to share any closing thoughts or remarks?
I'm just really grateful for you, Leah, for being part of this conversation and bringing such a rich dialogue to us. Just gratitude. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, a lot of gratitude, Leah. And whenever you come to Central Oregon to visit Wynn or Patty and Patty, know that you are welcome here, and we would love to have you in our city. So thank you again to everyone that is here and watching. This recording will be shared in the next couple of days with all the resources and links to the books and the videos and the folks that Leah shared. And again, thank you to Jack Schneip for sponsoring this event, and to Dudley's Bookshop is where we bought this awesome book. And to Leah and her team for their time with us today. Again, if you want a copy of the book, feel free to reach out and support our work. Thank you again for watching and being with us. And with that, stay healthy, stay brave, speak up, speak out, and in solidarity, we end tonight. Thank you.